And going into session 2 for today, I'd like to introduce you to Conor Smith. Conor is a project officer on the Art of the Future project, and I will hand over session 2 for you to facilitate. Thanks, Conor.
Thanks very much, Nicole. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We are running a little ahead of schedule, so which is probably a good thing for the end of the day, as we do have a big day ahead of us. I guess just before we get into our next session with Vaughn Bennison, I am one of the project officers who have been working on the Art of the Future program throughout the last year. So myself and my colleagues, Renee and Madison, we have been the ones kind of drumming up a lot of the content, trying to get the job seekers job ready, helping them with resumes, all that kind of stuff, especially considering a lot of them maybe don't have, they've never really had those opportunities that Graham spoke about. So a lot of times you don't really know what you need to know until you need to know it. So we've been trying to help bridge that gap with them. But we've also been trying to develop things for yourselves as employers to understand, okay, well, what do I need to know? Because again, at the same time, if you've never potentially come across a blind or vision impaired worker, then it can be difficult to know what is available and what is out there in the community, and definitely is a lot. So that's basically been our role. So I just want to give a little introduction to myself. So for our next session, I'm just moving over to my document. I'm listening to my computer speak to me. We have Vaughn Bennison, who is going to be speaking to us. Now, excuse me. So Vaughn is the Executive Officer at Disability Voices Tasmania. And Vaughn is going to be speaking to us about the importance of people with disability in management, affecting change from the top, promoting inclusion and diversity strategies, and I guess his own experiences in his career. So Vaughn, welcome, and would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Conor. I assume you can hear me. Not sure
Yes.
how good my video
perfect.
is, but I'm sure someone will let me know if I need to make any changes.
Perfect.
Firstly, I'd like to thank Blind Citizens Australia for the opportunity to speak to you today and commend BCA on the work that it's done over the last few years in regard to the Art of the Future project. It's something I've been watching very closely, and I've had a fairly close involvement with BCA as I produce their weekly radio program, New Horizons. So that comes down to, I guess, starting to talk about me. But just before I do that, I want to acknowledge the work that Graham Innes and other people of Graham's generation have done on paving the way to improve the situation of employment for blind and vision impaired people right across Australia. The employment landscape for people who are blind or vision impaired has changed hugely over the last 50 years or more. And in some regards, a lot of the jobs and the employment opportunities that were open to blind and vision impaired people in the 40s and 50s and even earlier than that don't exist anymore. And I'm thinking things like, for example, piano tuning. Graham did mention vaguely basket weaving, and that's not entirely a joke. There were a lot of people who were blind or vision impaired who were involved in basket weaving and other manufacturing. And they were really good opportunities for people who were blind or vision impaired to get employment. We used to call them sheltered workshops, but it's a lot more than that, I think. And it's something, we should congratulate those people as well for paving the way for employment. That's all changed now, of course, because a lot of those types of jobs and a lot of those avenues aren't open to blind and vision impaired people anymore. I had a very different experience, I think, in some respects from Graham, because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I left school. I did have a similar experience in that my parents very much believed that I, as a blind person, should be treated just like everybody else, except to say that I did go to a blind boarding school for a while, as I think from memory did Graham. I actually went to a blind boarding school in New Zealand, and when I came to Australia, I went to a regular primary school in Melbourne and to a regular high school. And whilst I didn't really apply myself particularly hard to school, I was smart enough to get away without, doing a huge amount of work. And get reasonably good marks, not great marks, but it really didn't leave me coming out of school with a knowledge of what I wanted to do. I went and studied music because I thought that was the only thing I was ever going to be any good at. And I was also told right from a very early age, probably from about 11 or 12, that if I didn't go to university, I would end up being a burden on society, and that going to university was my only avenue for getting work in the future. Needless to say, I didn't really get a lot of work out of going to university. I did do, and I guess this is kind of where I made the start of my career, I did do quite a lot of university work and study in audio engineering and also radio and broadcasting. So I've spent the last 25 years as a broadcaster. After coming out of university, I ran my own business for some time where I did a few things. I ran my own studio for a while, and I also did some adaptive technology. We used to call it adaptive technology. It tends to be assistive technology these days. I did some tutoring, training, and repairs, and all of that sort of thing. And I did a few other little things. I had a similar experience in that once I finished university, I did apply for a lot of jobs in and around Brisbane. In fact, at one stage, I also applied for jobs in Melbourne because I was thinking that I couldn't get any work in Brisbane, so perhaps the idea might be that we move to Melbourne, where there's arguably, at that time certainly, a lot more work available. I wasn't particularly successful. I don't really know why that was. I do know that there are a couple of jobs that I didn't get because I'm blind. And no one ever said that, but it was pretty clear from the way they grilled me about how a blind person could do that job. And then I didn't get a second interview. So it's really very much a feeling. I'm certainly not throwing aspersions at anybody. But I think for the most part, it was really probably because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I didn't really, apply myself very hard. But over the years working in broadcasting, I got a really good understanding of the broadcasting sector, and in 2012 I located the opportunity to apply for the manager role at Print Radio Tasmania, which is Tasmania's RPH service, or radio reading service. It provides read or printed information in spoken form for people with print disability, and it's a statewide service. I was successful in getting that job, and to this day, I don't know how, but I just lucked out, I guess they say these days. It was a very, very lucky opportunity. In fact, I remember when I did the interview, we went right through the entire interview and nothing about blindness had come up. And they said, have you got any other questions for us? I said, well, you do realise I'm blind, right? And he said, well, we kind of figured that from your resume, because I don't disclose before doing an interview. But it's really obvious if you read my resume and my information statement and things like that, because I talk about the work that I've done teaching Braille and all of that sort of thing. And he said to me, do you think that's a problem? And I thought, this is the first time I have ever been asked, do you think it's an issue? Typically, my experience had been, we think this is an issue because. So to be actually asked, do you think that's a problem, with an obvious leaning towards we don't see it as a problem, was pretty amazing to me. Chiefly the reason that they took that approach was because they actually had been blind people working in management at that organisation previously. So, and as I say, that was an amazing experience. I got that job, and I've worked in management ever since. I think the importance of people working in management who are blind or vision impaired cannot be understated, particularly in areas where there might be other blind and vision impaired people who might conceivably work in the organisation. Once I finished working at Print Radio Tasmania, and I will come back to it shortly, but once I finished working at Print Radio Tasmania, I was headhunted to manage the Tasmanian arm of Visibility, which is the blindness service provider in Tasmania. It's actually based in Western Australia, but I was asked to come and manage their therapy services. I did that for a bit over a year and was then made redundant, and I moved into a disability policy officer role with the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, where for the first time I had the experience of being managed by another blind person, which was absolutely fascinating and a really worthwhile experience. In August this year, I applied for and was successful in getting the role of Executive Officer of Disability Voices Tasmania, which is an organisation which seeks to equalise the playing field, I guess you could say, for people with disability in Tasmania. Why should people who are blind or vision impaired work in management? Well, I guess arguably it opens up the discussion about people with disability working in an organisation. I think it's easy to have people with disability working at lower levels within an organisation, and my experience with disability employment service providers, for example, admittedly some time ago, the number of times I was offered jobs like moving supermarket trolleys and things like that, I guess they couldn't really understand that a blind person pushing a whole row of supermarket trolleys around probably wasn't the greatest idea, at least if they were concerned about people's cars and paint jobs and things like that. I was also offered roles working at checkouts and supermarkets and things like that, which again, not a very practical role for a blind person, but I guess they went somewhere. Those jobs, of course, are really important, and they're really important for a lot of people to get a good start. But working in management gives you the opportunity to open an organisation up to develop greater understanding and greater empathy for other disabled people and other groups or minority groups within the community. It gives you the opportunity to set the tone for an organisation, at least for your team within that organisation, and if you're the CEO, for the organisation generally. And even if you are setting the tone for your team or your area within the organisation, if you are the type of person who is an advocate and who is a very strong believer in what you're doing, you have the power to, to move your point of view across to other teams and other areas. And I think that's vitally important because we do need to see change in this area. We've talked about the significant gap between the employment rate for disabled people and also for non-disabled people. And I think that gap needs to be equalised. And that's not going to happen if we don't see people with disability at management level, working higher up in organisations to develop inclusion strategies and develop empathy for people with disability and develop jobs that are welcoming of people with disability. I wonder how many organisations that are represented here today have people with disability at senior management level. Certainly Blind Citizens Australia does. Vision Australia has done and continues to. I don't know how many other organisations here, but have a think about your organisation and think about how many people who identify as having a disability work high up in your organisation, and what impact do they have across your organisation, and what does your employment of people with disability look like? Do you have mandatory targets, for example, for people with disability? It's not common, but it does happen. It's certainly not common in Australia. What does your Disability Inclusion Action Plan look like? And I was very lucky last year to be in a position to develop the Disability Inclusion Action Plan revision and updates. It's a 3-year plan for ACAN, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, which is an organisation that is very much committed to equalising communication for people with disability. And it practices really strong inclusion. It employs people with disability at its heart, at senior level as well as at junior level. And it has worked for the rights and the equal opportunity of people with disability since its inception, as of course has Blind Citizens Australia. Let's have a bit of a look though at making it possible for people who are blind or vision impaired to work in management. One of the main things that I think we need to think about is a culture of openness. If we're open to the idea that people who are blind or vision impaired can work in our organisations, then we need to be open to the idea that they can work in our organisations at management level. And how do we make that possible? And I guess the first thing I would say is give people a chance. Give people the chance to fail, the opportunity to act in a role temporarily. Make it possible for people to have the opportunity to learn, to be mentored, and to develop partnerships with the organisation or within the organisation with other people in management. And that very often requires, as I said, a spirit of openness and a spirit of willingness to share and to act as a mentor and as a partner to somebody who works in your organisation. And we should all be doing that anyway, because whilst we're all very protective of our own roles and our own jobs within our organisation, I mean, why wouldn't we be? We need to think about the future, because we're not all going to be around forever. And you could be in a position where, like I was when I got headhunted by Visibility, you could leave an organisation at fairly short notice, and suddenly you could leave a gap that could have been filled by somebody if you had only taken the time to mentor them into the role. So making sure that that happens, I think, is of vital importance. But also making it known that your organisation is open to employing people with disability. And Graham mentioned this in his speech. He talked about the importance of making statements like people with disability are welcome to apply. I think we need to go beyond that, because I think that it's obvious people with disability are welcome to apply, because if they weren't, that would be discrimination. I think we need to be saying things like, we encourage applications from people with disability. If you have a disability and would like adjustments made to the candidature process, please let us know. How can we help you with the job interview? How can we make this more accessible for you? We need to be making statements, and we need to be asking questions right from the outset in the application process, so that we can make it known that we are willing to listen and willing to work towards improving the employment for people with a disability. In terms of making your workplace more accessible and more conducive to having people who are blind or vision impaired working there, thinking about your software environment, or as I call SOE, software operating environment from my IT days. Many applications these days are accessible. Not as many as we would wish, but there are operations and environments that are accessible. Understanding about what a screen reader is, and a screen reader, for those who don't know, is a piece of software that sits on your computer and enables people who are blind to either read by voice or in Braille what's coming up on the computer screen. Making sure that your IT people have a willingness to investigate these things, instead of saying, no, it's a stray piece of software, I don't understand it, therefore we are not installing it on our system. Or creating barriers such as that, because that can be absolutely soul-destroying for a blind person who gets a job. Typically in larger organisations this happens, but it does happen in smaller organisations as well. They get the job, and then the IT people nix it by saying, no, we're not having it installed on our system, or we're not going to let you connect your Braille display to our system because it's a USB device and we don't allow that. That is very clear and blatant discrimination in my view, and I suspect in many other people's view.
Vaughn, sorry, it's just Conor here. I'm just looking at the time. I'm just wondering if you would be happy to wrap up and we can move to some questions.
I'm absolutely happy to do that. I think I've covered all my salient points, so I'm absolutely happy to answer any questions.
Okay, cool. Let me just switch over, listening to Jaws. Okay, so some of the questions that have come through from last week when we put a call out. So one of the questions would be, Vaughn, would you always require like big modifications to a workplace, or would some of them be minor?
In my experience, in all of the jobs, particularly at management level, I haven't required many at all, and very little cost. there are free screen readers available that can work in some certain circumstances, but remembering too that many of the modifications that might be required are paid for or can be paid for through job access. Many people who are blind, for example, already have any software or equipment they need. Modifications that you might require might be things like making sure that you have a desk that's closer to the door. So if you've got a big wide open office, you don't have to go finding your desk. You know exactly where it is from the door. And also, of course, that makes it easier from an emergency evacuation point of view. So no, not a lot of requirements generally, I don't think.
Okay, great. And I guess
Conor, it's Cheryl here. Sorry, just to jump in for a moment. Vaughn, your camera, could you just tilt your camera up towards your face a little bit more? We can see your braille display. Yep, that's much better. Thank you.
Sorry, my computer's a very long way away. Typically, I have my screen closed.
Thanks, Cheryl. Vaughn, I guess the next question, is kind of pertinent to your role as being someone who is in management. So, how do you go interviewing candidates for a job? Is it different because you can't see, like in terms of facial expressions or how well presented they are? What's your experience with that?
I guess I buck the trend a little bit because I'm not as concerned as some organisations would be about the way that people present physically, and particularly because most of the areas in which I've worked sort of rely on, or I guess you could say working from home or not in the public eye, for example. So I don't focus so much on presentation. And typically, of course, you're not the only person who is involved in an interview panel. So I would usually have somebody who can see as part of the interview panel, and I might ask them questions about how they presented, whether they had any, what their attitude looked like, what their body language looked like. But more often than not, you can tell a response to a question, or you can tell what the candidate is thinking about and feeling based on the way they talk and the things that they say. I did once have a candidate burst into tears in the middle of an interview, which was quite confronting because she didn't understand the question. And fortunately, one of the other people that I was conducting the interview with was able and comfortable to deal with that sort of situation. I don't honestly know how I would have dealt with it if I'd been on my own. So I don't think there's a lot of differences. I don't think there's a lot that I would advise. But just it's very important to listen to people's tone of voice, listen to what they say, the words they use, the way they speak and the way they come across, which to me is far more important than how they're dressed and what they physically, how they physically appear.
Great. I just have a couple more here that were sent in. I suppose we've spoken this morning and heard this morning about, barriers maybe, or obstacles or challenges in general in terms of maybe people getting work. But do you find there's any specific to management in your experience in terms of your vision loss?
I think Graham made the point quite succinctly in his comments this morning that by the time you get to sort of management level, those barriers and those abilities generally are fewer because I guess by the time you're looking for management roles, people assume that you've obviously been there before and that you wouldn't be applying for it if you didn't know what you were talking about. It doesn't mean they don't exist. I've had questions in the past like, how will you manage people? How will you know if they're skiving off? How will you, keep an eye on what people are doing in the workplace and manage that workplace culture type thing? My view is that I'm very much based, I very much base my career and my operations on outcomes. So it's very obvious if people are skiving off by virtue of the fact that they're not getting their job done. If they're having chats, I'm not too worried about that so long as they're getting the work done and getting the work done on time and to a standard that I would expect and that the organisation for which I'm working would expect. So I think, that sort of answers the question, but I think that getting work at management level really is very much based on the quality of your resume, the quality of the way that you answer interview questions, and the quality of how you come across as an individual, and whether the people who are interviewing you or the selection panel have confidence in your ability to do the job. And typically, I think once you get to the point of being recruited or going for management level positions, there is an expectation that you are starting, that you're starting from a position of knowing what you're doing, and you're able to put that faith across to the selection panel.
Great. Look, and final question before we move on to You Can't Ask That panel. Who, within a workplace, who do you think kind of bears responsibility for making a workplace accessible, in your own view?
Look, I think my approach to the workplace is that everybody is responsible for most things. And I think that every worker and every board member or whoever is governing the organisation is responsible for workplace accessibility. Because as I indicated earlier, accessibility is not just a physical thing, it's a cultural thing. As an example of that, if you do a screen share on a Zoom meeting, that is technically inaccessible. But if you do a screen share on a Zoom meeting and you have sent the material that you're going to be sharing to blind people ahead of time, then that mitigates that. And anybody can do that. Anybody who's running a meeting can do that. And the other thing is that if you have the type of workplace where there are hazards put in place. So for example, if you work in a factory or a restaurant where there might be chairs or products or equipment that's moved from time to time, making sure that those things are put back in the same place to make the walkways clear for blind and vision impaired people so that they can walk through the workplace safely is everybody's role and everybody's responsibility. But it comes from the top. And if the CEO, from the CEO down, and if the CEO doesn't understand the need for accessibility, then what tends to happen is that you get one or two people who are, I guess you could call them accessibility ambassadors or zealots who will work towards making things accessible. But often what happens is when those people leave, it all goes by the wayside. So it's got to be an organizational culture. An organizational culture change to improve accessibility, not just for blind and vision impaired people, but for all people with disability.
Great. Thank you so much, Vaughn. And thank you very much for your time and sharing your story. Now, Vaughn is going to be joining us in our next session that we're going into. So we're going to have a You Can't Ask That panel. Some people might be familiar with that from the ABC, as they did, I guess, a similar concept a couple of years ago. And I guess the premise of this is that, as Graham has said, as Vaughn has said, sometimes there can be a hesitancy to maybe ask questions that you're curious about. And sometimes you don't know what you don't know, but you don't maybe want to step on somebody's toes, or you're worried about being discriminatory when you're just trying to be curious. So I guess the aim of this is to kind of explore some of the questions that have been sent into us. And then if there's anything that we kind of didn't get to, then we are hoping to throw it open to employment-related questions from the audience if there is anything somebody feels we didn't cover. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce Vaughn, as we already know. I'd also like to introduce Rocco and Roslyn. So Rocco, Vaughn has already introduced himself and given a little background. Just before we kick off, Rocco, would you like to just give a quick background as to who you are and where you come from? And then I'll go to Roslyn, and then we'll kick it off. Can't hear you, Rocco. If you think you're on unmute. Cheryl, do we have Rocco?
Sorry, Conor, we did have Rocco on the line. I'll just check.
Okay, Roslyn, do we have you? Would you like to share your just a quick background before we get started while we wait for Rocco?
Audio now unmuted.
Yeah, hello?
Yep, we can hear you. We can hear your jaws as well. Yep. So, yeah.
Sorry, I'll
That's
shut
okay.
yours up. I'm Ros Sackley. I've been an educator most of my life, and there are stories to tell another day. But also, I have, done a lot in different sectors of the education system. You can imagine the work of a blind Aboriginal teacher. So, as I say, it's a long story. But also now I have my own micro business which I work on, and so I'm very happy. But in between all that, I'm a Niampa woman from the central west of New South Wales, but live presently in Darkinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales.
Great. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming along. Cheryl, do we have Rocco back online?
No, we don't at the moment. I've sent him a message and asked if he can join online again. What we might do for now, I have a couple of extra questions that have been mailed in for Vaughn, if that's okay, if I just ask Vaughn those questions first, and then we'll go on to the You Can't Ask That panel.
Yeah, okay, if you prefer to do that, yeah.
Yep, thank you. Won't be too long, Roslyn.
That's fine.
Vaughn, similar questions to what was asked of Graham. People are asking about what were the most helpful things that employers did to support you at the beginning of your career?
That's a really interesting question. I think one of the most important thing that my first real, and I'm not factoring in my small business that I ran, I'm thinking of my first role in management, was to allow me to sort of feel my way a little bit and work out what I needed to do in terms of making the workplace more accessible, and also to provide me with the assistance to do that. I was very lucky in that my first management role, we had a station president who, like me, had spent a number of years in IT, and we were able to very quickly, because I needed to, make all of the computers in the station accessible so that I could use all of the studios and all of the computers across the station that I needed to. As well, all of the people that I worked with were very open and willing to share, willing to work with me to establish ways and means for me to do all of the aspects of my job. And as a radio station manager, particularly in that context, there's a lot of different aspects to the role, from producing radio programs to broadcasting daily to teaching, training other up and coming broadcasters, to managing the staff and the volunteers. We had 2 staff or 4 staff in the end, and 120 volunteers that I managed on a daily basis, and we had to make sure that everything ran smoothly. So I guess what I would say is the most helpful things that people did were just being open and listening to what my needs were, helping me work through making sure that those needs were met. And of course, the on-flow effect from that was that we became a station that was completely accessible to people who were blind or vision impaired, and was willing and open to have volunteers and other staff who were blind or vision impaired.
Terrific, thank you. And just one more question that I have, which is, in your view, is there one sticking point in the employment of blind and vision impaired job seekers, and what do you think it is?
I'm not sure I'd say there's one sticking point. I really think that a willingness to be open and to accept change and to accept diversity is probably the biggest sticking point that I have, or that I can think of rather. And I think that if we can get people to understand, and this is what comes back to my earlier discussion of having blind and vision impaired people working in management. If you have people with disability working in management and working at the top of your organization, that opens up the culture then to understand, so that when your organization is recruiting, you can, and you get a blind person come in as a candidate, you can look at them and think, well, I know how that can be done because I've seen it done by X, Y, or Z. And, the Eye to the Future project particularly focuses on internships and getting people who are blind or vision impaired into work. And there's a lot of people here today who are bringing their experience to provide that level of understanding. And there's certainly, areas for expansion and ongoing discussion in that area. I think that's probably what I would say to that.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions. Sorry about that, Conor. Now, Rocco hasn't actually come back, so you may want to ask Vaughn Rocco's questions. And
we'll just go ahead with Vaughn and Roslyn, and we'll see how much we can get through. So that's all good. Okay, so thanks for that, Gerald.
Sorry, Conor, I wonder,
Roslyn.
Sorry, I wonder if I just might make a very brief point pertinent to what you were saying before. You're a JAWS user, I'm a JAWS user, and you're listening to your computer speak to you. It's worth pointing out that I'm a Braille reader, and so I use Braille as my primary means of accessing things like this. So it's just a different, acknowledging the different approaches that people take to being able to do their work.
Oh, definitely. Thank you for that, Vaughn. I guess, Roslyn, I'd like to go to you, for our first question that has been submitted. Is safety an issue for you when you're navigating the workplace? How do you get around this?
Of course, it has been in the past, but seeing I have my own little micro business, I make sure that things are in the right place, and they have to stay in the right place. But yes, I have worked in educational institutions and other facilities where safety has been difficult.
Which is also interesting because as we heard from Graham earlier on, as a rule, there is no higher findings of safety risks or anything to someone who is blind or vision impaired in the workplace. But often that is, a perception that people would have. Vaughn, my next question is to you. Is traveling to and from work for you and getting to meetings more difficult? How do you get around this?
Firstly, I'd like to make a comment on the previous question, if I may.
Yeah, definitely.
I think you're right that there was or is a perception that safety is a problem for people who are blind or vision impaired, and that happens in all areas of life, not just work. I don't know how many times I've been told, no, you should take the lift because there's stairs and you can't manage stairs as a blind person. Now, there are some blind people who can't manage stairs because they might have balance issues or things like that, but you can never take for granted that that your assumption is true. And I think it's really important that we understand that assumptions can be incredibly damaging. And there are so many times where we see people who are blind or vision impaired who are being employed in areas where hitherto they weren't employed because of an argument around safety. And I'm thinking in particular, there was a discussion that I had where someone had been discriminated against because they had lost a significant amount of sight and they worked in a restaurant kitchen. And they were sacked because it was deemed by the risk assessment people that they couldn't manage in a kitchen as a partially sighted person or a vision impaired person. I spoke recently to a guy who is significantly vision impaired who's running his own cafe and restaurant. So very clearly, things can be put in place to manage those safety risks and make sure that they are not unacceptable risks to people who are blind or vision impaired, or because of people who are blind or vision impaired to other people. In terms of your question, Conor, around travelling to and from work into meetings, one of the big advantages that the COVID pandemic has provided to people with disability is working from home. So many times now we see online meetings as the norm, and that is a real advantage for a lot of people with disability, but not necessarily for everyone. And I'm thinking deafblind people, for example, for whom online meetings may not be necessarily as easy. And again, that's not the case for everyone. I was really lucky when, in most of my working career, to have had a fairly easy walking route to all of my workplaces, including my role as manager of print radio, where I'm literally a block and a half away from the station, so it took me 10 minutes each way. There are ways and means of getting around to meetings if you have to do face-to-face meetings, but what can be difficult is once you get there, say for example you get a taxi or an Uber to a meeting place and it's on the 3rd floor, actually getting to that 3rd floor environment, if you're not familiar with the building, can be somewhat more difficult. But there are services around, and Graham mentioned earlier AIRA, which is AIRA, and that's a service where a sighted person is on the other end of your phone camera and telling you what's around you and where you need to go. If you have to go somewhere regularly, you'll be hearing later today about orientation and mobility. There are orientation and mobility and guide dog instructors who can teach you routes. Some of us are very lucky in that we are good travellers and able to learn those routes ourselves without the need for additional people. So yes, in some respects it could be argued that it's more difficult, but it's not insurmountable, and it certainly shouldn't be an impediment to blind or vision impaired people working in an environment where travel is required.
Great, thank you so much, Vaughn. And Rocco, I hear that you have joined us.
Yeah.
So we're just doing our You Can't Ask That panel. So I was just wondering if you'd just like to quickly introduce yourself and who you work for, and maybe we can fire some questions your way.
Yes, hi everyone. It's Rocco here. I am working at KPMG Australia. I'm in technology advisory, and a very, I guess, short background about me is that I originally went to university and I did finance and accounting, and I spent the first sort of 10 years of my career as a chartered accountant before moving into software. Probably about 6 years into that period, I lost my vision suddenly, and since then I've transitioned to, I guess, being blind and still working at the same job and doing the same type of technology consulting. And I guess being an accountant, I guess one of those little advantages is that over the last few years, there's been a lot of service providers who have had to transition to the NDIS model and have needed back-end accounting systems, which I understand intimately.
Great, thanks so much, Rocco. And look, and I have a question here for you, maybe to kick us off. And I think this is a big one that often comes up in the, I guess, for people who are blind or vision impaired in general, but I guess also in a workplace. You know, in your view, when talking to a person who is blind or vision impaired, is it okay to use terms like see and saw and, you know, did you watch the TV last night or whatever? What's your opinion on this? And I'd like to hear from the other panelists as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally have no issue with any of those terms. I use them myself. I often tell my friends that I'll see them later or I'll see them soon. And I refer to, you know, TV programs that, you know, I am watching the latest Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power on Amazon. So I use all those terminologies as well. The only thing that I find a little bit, you know, a bit PC at the moment is using the word blind to substitute for the word ignorant. So if you say something to the effect of I was blind to this issue, when you could use the word I was unaware or I was ignorant, I didn't know the facts. So using a blind term like that is something that I think should be discussed, and we should, as a society, move away from. Just in the way that we have moved away from other words in our vernacular. But in terms of those other type of things that you mentioned, yeah, absolutely no problems at all.
That's great. What about yourself, Roslyn? What do you think about when if like those types of terminology? I personally don't have a problem with myself, but yeah, interested to know others' thoughts.
Yeah, no worries about them. I've observed people going around there, you know, basically getting their thesauruses out and trying to, wow, what's another word for watch or see or whatever, you know, and it's just so unnecessary for them to go through all that because it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, a lot of times it's about intent. It's not meant to be different. It's just Yeah, so definitely. What about yourself, Vaughn? I think Rocco and Roslyn have kind of covered it, but you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I add my support to Rocco's comments around what we typically these days call ableist language, and I think Rocco has it absolutely right. We need to get away from using terms that refer to disabled people or people with disability in terms of equating them to ignorance, thoughtlessness, problematic. So, saying that that someone was blind to an issue is completely inappropriate, and I think we very clearly need to move away from that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Vaughn, next one here, I think is more pointed maybe in your direction. So this person says that their company uses remote access with Citrix. Does this pose, in your knowledge, any issues with screen readers like JAWS or NVDA? And do extra provisions need to be made?
Well, look, I can comment briefly on this, but I wonder whether Rocco might be a better person to aim it at with his work in technology. But certainly JAWS in particular, and I think there are other screen readers that do have support for remote access, and Citrix in particular. My experience with Citrix is that in the situation where I used it when I was working with visibility was that it made things significantly slower than it really needed to be. And I think my feeling is, and Rocco, perhaps you can comment on this, that people are now moving away from that style of operation more. But certainly people who are blind or vision impaired do have access to remote access protocols like Citrix.
That's great. Rocco, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I know that in terms of the Microsoft Terminal Server, there are ways and means that people can get access to that if they have technologies loaded on a virtual server. But for instance, at the moment, in my company, we log in using a VPN from Citrix, and I get full access to everything, and it doesn't pose any problems to me whatsoever. I know that's slightly different to remote logging into another system, but I personally don't have any problems accessing any of the company resources that I need to use.
Great. The next question I have is for you, Roslyn. I'm just wondering if you're in a larger meeting, especially if you're conducting a larger meeting, how would you usually go about doing that? Is there any modifications that you might need to make? Or I guess what's your plan of attack when it comes to larger meetings? Yeah, especially if you're facilitating.
I haven't actually had, I'm quite willing to trade this question. I haven't actually conducted huge meetings, but of course, accessibility question would be there all the time, and taking consideration of noise factors. I certainly wouldn't use overheads or anything like that. I would talk to the subject that I was there for. I have been in larger meetings and seen some of them not well conducted. But if anyone else wants to answer the rest of that, yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw that open to you, gentlemen.
I've got some comments if Rocco wants to go first. Yeah. Look, I think I'd add my support to Roslyn's comments there. Overheads are a real problem. If you must use overheads, because I do recognise that some people are visual learners. I, despite being blind, am a visual learner, and I appreciate having written things in front of me. As I said, I'm a Braille user, so typically I would read them in Braille. But if you must have overheads, then speaking to those overheads, making sure that anybody who can't see them for any reason has full access, and definitely, when I conduct meetings, I make sure that no overheads are used unless they've been provided to me and other blind and vision impaired people ahead of time, so that we can bring along our pieces of technology and read them as we go. The other thing I would say is when you're conducting larger meetings and group activities, and I'm thinking particularly things like strategic planning, which can often be quite visual, and certainly in management, something that we do a lot as organisations sort of prepare themselves to move into the future. avoid activities that are quintessentially visual. I was recently a part of a strategic planning session where the person who was conducting the session asked us to go up and draw a picture of something that was related to what we thought had been successful in the organisation across the previous 12-month period. That very specifically excludes people who are blind or vision impaired. And whilst you can team up with somebody who can draw the picture for you, it still gives the feeling of being excluded. There are other ways you could manage that. You could, for example, you could do something like make up a little poem that reflects something that you think is has been successful, or do an interpretive dance, or make some sort of, I don't know, dialogue up or something like that, so that you're not excluding people and you're making it possible for people to contribute to the activity in a way that is meaningful to them.
That's great. Rocco, I have a question here for you, and I guess this was explored by some of the other speakers earlier on. Can you think of maybe 2 or 3 things your employer did to make your workplace more accessible or more, I guess, friendly for your position, or even just like what might have been useful in terms of job access, who we'll be hearing from earlier on, just in terms of being able to do your work tasks and get around your office?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I might start at the end of that, which start by saying that, you know, I've used job access multiple times over the last sort of 9 years since I've been blind. And most of those are just for an initial consultation and getting me set up with the technology that I needed. And then since then, it's been upgrades and updates as technology has moved along in terms of getting new versions of software. So job access are fantastic to work with. And specifically the technology that they've supplied me with has been a screen reader called JAWS and the updates to that. And then that has just been very easy with my employer, with KPMG. So just basically getting their sign off that, you know, I do require it for my job. It's pretty much just a form that they need to acknowledge. So it's pretty simple from the employer's perspective. In terms of other significant, more significant things that the employer, my KPMG, has been involved with, there was probably some initial stuff around getting the lift programmed so that it worked in a slightly different way to other people, so that I was able to, you know, select which floor I needed to go to on a independent basis. So that was something I worked with, you know, the workplace people on. And I think Graham maybe even mentioned this in his keynote, was I was given a normal desk, or what do we call a non-hot desk? Instead of a hot desk, I was given a dedicated desk that was booked out permanently for me on the days when I was going to be in the office. So that was a couple of those things. And a few minor changes. There were some pot plants, apparently beautiful looking pot plants that were hanging from the ceiling that were, you know, a bit of a hazard for me to run into, and they were moved. So some minor things and a few other things.
Right, thank you. Roslyn, a question here. How do you go about using things like Microsoft Word, Excel, Outlook, you know, all these sort of base functions of any office?
And that's to me, Conor, as well.
Oh, actually, you know what? Well, I'll go to Roslyn first, and then I'll throw open to yourself, Rocco and Vaughn. I'm
willing to trade half of the question. I'm not good at Excel, but yeah, my screen reader JAWS lets me know what's there, and I have no difficulty doing editing, writing. Excel, what were the other programs?
So like basically everything in the Office suite. So, you know, Microsoft Word, Excel.
Oh, Outlook. Yeah, no worries at all. But as I say, I'm not brilliant. I'm not an accountant. So I haven't used Excel excessively.
Yeah, one of the things that I actually do love with Excel is the define name feature. Now, I don't know if that's specific to screen reading, but basically it means I could be a million lines down and a million rows into Excel and I'll still know what column I'm on or what row I'm on. You know, so all these things are kind of possible. What about yourself, Rocco? How do you go about using it, and do you find any issues, or is there anything that works really, really well in terms of the office?
Yeah. So, I mean, I use the Microsoft Office suite every single day. Loads of emails. We also use Teams internally. So, a lot of, I guess, posts that have just replacing internal emails these days. But lots of emails, Teams posts, those kind of meetings, online virtual meetings from that perspective, and then a lot of Word and loads of Excel. So I kind of mentioned that I was, you know, involved in financial software. That process usually involves a client or prospective client sending a spreadsheet with maybe multiple sheets and multiple tabs, and maybe hundreds of rows. So it's very common that I would work through a spreadsheet that's got 800, 900 rows, and the ability to interpret that information, read that information, respond to each of those rows, etc. I am an accountant, so I do like spreadsheets. I do my own spreadsheets when I do my tax, and I do my own spreadsheets for all sorts of different personal purposes as well. And I love my formulas and concatenation and all that sort of stuff, if people know that. So yeah, I use Excel all the time. I think that's answered that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. Vaughn, I've got one more question for you, Vaughn, and then maybe we might throw it open to the audience just in case, just to see if there's anything that maybe hasn't been broached that maybe somebody would like to ask.
Sorry, can I just make a comment before you move on to the next one?
Of course.
Regarding using the software. Remember that, as I pointed out, a lot of software is not accessible, but there are ways that software can be made accessible if it's not out of the box. There are things that you can put together called scripts that will make a screen reader behave in a certain way with particular pieces of software. So if something is not accessible out of the box, there is often workarounds that can be made by people who know what they're doing, and they can be fairly cost effective and fairly cheap, and also they can be funded through job access and other funding processes. So, you know, don't think that because the software you think is inaccessible means that you can't employ a person who's blind or vision impaired.
And Vaughn, that's a really good point. And so in your experience, I realize you don't work necessarily in that space, but who would be the kinds of people that somebody might go to see about getting a JAWS script written up for Salesforce, as an example?
I have worked in this field in the past. I don't know who the individuals would be in Australia, but there are ways of finding out. Some of the adaptive technology providers, I think you're going to hear later from Quantum Technology, they may do it. Certainly they would know somebody who would. But you can learn to do it yourself. I've done a very small amount of scripting for JAWS for Windows. I certainly wouldn't call myself an expert. But there are a lot of people across the world. And of course, because we're talking about software and the internet and all of that, you can really get someone from anywhere to be able to do it. And they can send you through the scripts that can then be installed and make it work.
That's great. And I guess my final question is, before we throw open to everyone else, sorry, there's a little bit of background noise, in terms of access in a workplace, Vaughn, how do you think it's okay for an employer to ask their disabled staff, I guess, how they would go about this and do some brainstorming?
I think that really depends on the context. I think that, yes, certainly it's okay to ask, but it's often not people's job to provide access. So if your role, for example, is an accountant in your organization, and suddenly the boss turns around and says, well, okay, you're the only disabled person we've got. We would need to improve our employment of people with disability. I want you to come up with a plan for how we might do that. The person might be willing to do that, but it's not part of their role to do it. And there are people whose professional role it is to help with providing that sort of service. So, look, I think it's okay to ask, but I think that it's also okay to say no, and it's not part of you know, you shouldn't assume that because you have a person with a disability working for you that they are automatically going to be your best authority on all issues affecting people with disability.
Okay, great. Thank you. So maybe we would like to see a raise of hands for anybody who would have an extra question, maybe that wasn't covered. Again, please try to make it around, I guess, employment, the office space, job seeking. I do realize it can be quite a curious space. Cheryl, do we have any hands up or any questions?
We do. We have one from Canberra Blind Society.
Yep, definitely. Would you like to unmute yourself? Hi, welcome.
Hi, it's Claire Manning, and I'm had the pleasure of working with Ros and a very experienced mentor team who all have different vision impairments, and they all use different technologies, which I find work really well, and I've learned a lot from them. My question is probably to Vaughn and Rocco, that in your workplaces, how have you managed when, you know, I think Vaughn, you mentioned earlier that you use Braille and sort of technology as well as JAWS. How have you managed that in the workplace, and has it created any issues? I hope that question makes sense. You
want to go first, Rocco?
Yeah, sure. So I have not learnt Braille, so I use audio, text to speech, and I use a combination of JAWS, and I also do a lot of work on my Apple devices, either my work issued iPhone, or I have a work issued iPad as well, which allows me to do a lot of meetings and stuff like that. So I've been able, I think, in most situations to access the information that I need. There are a lot of, you know, text manuals that I've had to get through. A lot of documentation, I guess, working in a accounting audit firm. So some of those I asked for the ability to use to read some of those with an app on my phone, which is called Voice Stream Reader, which just does a better job of reading PDFs than some of the other programs. And so, you know, KPMG has made some of those, or, you know, investigated those in the right way with a little bit of due diligence, and said, yep, this is a kosher app, and it works well, and it's secure. And so that's sort of maybe one of those little challenges that I've had to get around. Most of the other systems that I've had to engage with are pretty accessible. There's been you know, one or two times where there's been some compulsory training that, you know, was a video based, and in those situations, you know, all my colleagues had to do them as well. So we just booked a room and did it together in a little training room.
So Rocco,
yeah.
Sorry, do you have other colleagues who are vision impaired at KPMG, or?
Maybe. I don't know. There's about 12,000 people, so I'm not across it in total. We have a disability inclusion committee where people are, you know, join, and they can either be part of the, you know, they identify as having a hidden or a visual available disability, or they can just be interested. So I don't really keep tabs on it. I believe there's a few people with low vision, but I'm not really 100%. I guess I've worked so closely with my team for such a long time that, you know, we often have work tasks that we need to do together anyway. So sometimes an emergency training or something we'll need to do together as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Do we have anything else?
I'll just briefly answer that. And I think that Rocco's point around KPMG doing due diligence and making sure that he had the apps and things available on his phone is, you know, very germane to the point I made earlier about IT security not being a barrier to employing people who are blind or vision impaired. As I said earlier, that can be a huge problem for a lot of people who cannot get access to the software and equipment they need because IT say, we don't understand it, we don't know what it is, we can't we can't make arrangements for it. In terms of my own management of technology in the workplace, I've been quite lucky that, generally speaking, I've worked for smaller organisations, and I've worked in software environments where the device you use is not necessarily the main point, so long as you can access the information you need. So I typically bring my own device, so I am prepared to have a fairly high quality computer, for example, that will run my screen reader, which typically is JAWS, although I do use others from time to time. And often it's higher spec than the machines that I would have been given by the organisation. But it is okay to ask the organisation to give you a higher spec machine if that's what you need to do. Sometimes the technology does let you down, and that can be a real problem. And sometimes, particularly when you're dealing with government departments and larger organisations, you will receive inaccessible materials such as PDF files, which are scanned images. And whilst you can very often get access to things like that in order to be able to read the correspondence that you need to read, it's always worthwhile pushing back a bit and saying, this is an inaccessible file. I'm a screen reader user. Please make sure that in future you provide files that I can actually access with my screen reader. If you want some tips and tricks on how to do that, here's a few links, and I'm happy to discuss it with you further and check things with you further. So it's about making sure that the people with whom you're corresponding have the opportunity to learn as well.
Thanks, Vaughn.
Thank you.
And I
did you want to say something, Roslyn? I think you might be on.
I'm
muted.
I'm a huge believer in technology, but of course it does let you down now and again. So I always I have my for making notes and reading. I have my Surface machine, which I'm on here today with, to write. And don't forget, machines have mainly got sound recorders, voice recorders on them now. And also I use a, which is our closest to pen and paper, is a hand frame. And I quite use them in my my business to do very small documents. And but I have to admit, not many people can use them now because you have to write backwards in Braille, and it's kind of mirror writing. So, but I love using it still. But also Braille displays and you know, whatever I need. So I always have backups.
Great, thank you. Cheryl, maybe do we have time for one or two more?
We do. We've actually had a couple of questions come in. One is for Rocco. It's regarding how your employer, KPMG, how did they support you when you first started at work?
Sure. So I guess, and understanding that I have worked within the same team for almost 19 years, and that has been partially within KPMG, who acquired my original business. And so out of that 19 years, I guess about 10 or 11 of those were as a fully sighted person, and then the last 9 have been as a fully blind person. So just to give a little bit of context to that. So I had an existing relationship with them, and they gave me a huge amount of support, both, you know, as a person from an emotional point of view, but then also as an employee, to be able to, I guess, re-engage. I guess the thing there was that I had some really good skills, and I understood what the job was already. So that was a head start, and it was just a process for me and for them to learn how to re-engage in terms of, you know, doing the same work in a slightly different way. And I can honestly say that the conversations that I have with my clients today are almost exactly the same as the conversations I would have had, you know, 15 years ago. You know, I know we've had a little bit of a joke about accounting, but accounting hasn't changed since the Italian guy invented it all those years ago. And so it is still a lot of the same topic area. So it was really, I mean, to really answer your question, it was really about relearning how to do the work in a slightly different way. And I would say that I've been just as successful as a blind person as I have been as a sighted person.
Great, thank you, Rocco. The only other question, this is actually probably for me. You mentioned that KPMG have a disability inclusion committee.
Yep.
I was wondering what exactly that involves. Is it like just disability, or is it all different types of inclusion?
KPMG has a number of different committees. So some of them are gender based. Some of them are sexuality based. And then the one that I refer to, which we call Embrace, is about disability and inclusion. So typically for people who have a physical disability or a mental disability, and they run specific programs. So just recently, they've actually run, I guess, something similar to what we're doing here, but for people with autism. So looking at some programs to increase the work participation for people with autism. So it has become quite a big topic within KPMG, and we have these regular meetings, and everyone is encouraged to come along, either to advocate for people with disabilities, or because they're interested, or because it touches on their work. There's been a lot of crossover into projects that we do for various departments, as I think Vaughn just mentioned. There's a lot of this stuff is internet based now, so there are a lot of projects that involve delivering services and apps and information technology, and accessibility is a part of that in today's world.
Great, thank you, Rocco. That was all for me, so I'll hand back to Conor if you have any more questions.
All right, thanks very much. Look, I don't really, I'd just like to thank yourself, Vaughn, Rocco, and Roslyn for your time and for answering those questions, because again, there's a lot of curiosity out there, and I'd really like to also thank anybody who submitted questions or who asked questions, because again, you don't know what you don't know. I've said that too many times now, but there's no harm in asking as long as it has a good intent behind it.